Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why a lifestyle that would have felt excessive just a few years ago now feels normal? Not impressive, not shocking, just expected. Scroll for a few seconds and it's all there. Frequent trips, nice restaurants on random weekdays, new clothes every week, perfectly balanced routines that look productive, healthy, and calm. And at some point, almost without noticing, a thought slips in. If everyone is living like this, then this must be normal. But that's exactly where the discomfort begins, because this feels normal, but it isn't. Almost no one pauses to question this shift. The kind of luxury we're talking about today isn't the obvious one. It's not private jets or mansions. It's the subtle, everyday version that presents itself as organization, self-care, or a well-deserved life. A coffee that costs more than it should, framed as a small pleasure. A trip that looks spontaneous yet fits perfectly into the feed. A wardrobe that's always updated, not to show off, but to look put together. And that's what makes it dangerous. It doesn't look like excess, it looks like stability. You may have felt this pressure before, that quiet sense that you're slightly behind, even though nothing is technically wrong. Your bills are paid, your life is functioning, yet when you compare your reality to what you see online, something feels off. It's not exactly envy, it's closer to confusion. Almost everyone misses this point. But the comparison isn't happening at the level of wealth, it's happening at the level of behavior. The routine itself has become the benchmark. This is where the dynamic starts to change. The people living this perfect routine aren't necessarily rich. In fact, most of them aren't. They're ordinary people with ordinary incomes trying to sustain an extraordinary rhythm. And that rhythm only looks simple because you're seeing it in fragments. A dinner here, a trip there, a quiet morning ritual, all neatly packaged and spaced out just enough to feel consistent. What you don't see is the structure holding it together, or how fragile that structure often is. This is where personal finance quietly collides with psychology, because once a lifestyle becomes normalized, it stops feeling optional. It starts to feel like a minimum requirement to belong, to be taken seriously, to feel like you're doing life right. And that's a heavy shift. The problem isn't luxury itself. The problem is that luxury has been rebranded as basic, as something you should be able to maintain without question. If this sounds familiar, stay with me for a moment. What you're about to notice may feel uncomfortable, but it's also clarifying. There's a reason so many people feel financially tense while appearing completely fine. There's a reason anxiety and consumption often grow side by side. And once you see how this version of normal is constructed, it becomes much harder to unsee it, which naturally leads us deeper into what's really happening behind this perfectly curated routine. And maybe that's why this topic tends to hit a nerve when people really sit with it, because once you start noticing this pattern, you realize how many of us are quietly carrying the same tension, just in different forms. If any part of this feels uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone in that. A lot of people are thinking it, but very few are actually saying it out loud. Sometimes, even acknowledging it to yourself already feels like a small relief. If you've ever caught yourself feeling pressured by a lifestyle that looks calm on the surface, but feels heavy underneath, it can help to put that into words. You can share it here, in your own way. What part of this routine culture has affected you the most? Was it the spending, the comparison, or simply the constant sense of needing to keep up? Conversations like this only stay alive when people are willing to show up honestly, and your voice matters more than you might think. And if this reflection resonates, even a small gesture like liking the video helps signal that this kind of discussion is worth spreading. It tells the platform that there are real people behind these screens who want something deeper than surface-level advice. Subscribing to isn't about numbers. It's about choosing to stay connected to a space where money, behavior, and mental pressure are talked about without judgment or pretending everything is fine. Because once you start pulling on this thread, it doesn't stop at what we see online. It begins to reveal how much of our financial stress is tied not to income, but to expectations we never consciously agreed to. And when you look a little closer at how this version of normal is actually sustained, the picture becomes even more complex and far more revealing. When you start looking closer, the first thing that quietly falls apart is the idea that this routine is being lived in real time. It looks organic, casual, almost effortless, but behind it there's planning, calculation, and a level of control that rarely gets acknowledged. This is where the illusion begins to crack. What feels like a natural lifestyle is often a sequence of moments carefully arranged to look continuous, even when they're not. The routine isn't lived, it's assembled. A lunch at a nice place doesn't mean eating out every day. It means choosing one moment that photographs well. A new outfit doesn't represent constant renewal. It represents timing. Purchases are spaced out, not because money is abundant, but because content needs to breathe. Almost no one talks about this part, but many of these decisions are financial choreography. Installments stretched just enough to feel manageable. Credit used as a bridge between image and reality. Environments selected for lighting and angles rather than comfort or consistency. That expensive coffee isn't a habit. It's a symbol, a visual cue that signals a certain identity. This seems harmless at first. After all, everyone curates something. But this is where the mental shift happens, because the feed doesn't show frequency. It shows exceptions, carefully selected and repeated until they feel like a pattern. And once those exceptions are presented as normal life, the pressure quietly transfers to the viewer. You're no longer comparing yourself to someone's reality, but to their highlights edited into a believable routine. That comparison carries an invisible impact. You start questioning your own decisions, your pace, your progress. You wonder why your life feels heavier, messier, less aesthetic. And the answer isn't that you're doing something wrong, it's that you're measuring your journey against a version of life that only exists in fragments. This is a loop that feeds anxiety without announcing itself. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It suggests that if others can maintain this rhythm, you should be able to as well. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because once you see how much of this routine is built for perception, you begin to notice how many financial decisions are being shaped by the camera, not by long-term clarity. Spending stops being about need or even pleasure and starts becoming about narrative. What story does this moment tell? How does it fit into the image of a balanced, successful life? Over time, those small choices accumulate, quietly transforming priorities, mental space, and emotional stability. The most unsettling part is realizing that none of this requires bad intentions. People aren't necessarily lying. They're participating in a system that rewards appearance over sustainability. And when enough people do it, the illusion strengthens. It starts to feel like truth, but behind the scenes, the backstory tells a different story. One filled with trade-offs, tension, and decisions made under pressure rather than alignment. If at any point you caught yourself thinking, "I've felt this," you're already seeing through the surface. And I'm curious how this lands for you. You can leave a comment saying, "This makes sense to me." At some point, the focus naturally turns inward, because this is where the real cost begins to surface. From the outside, everything looks calm, controlled, even aspirational. But internally, the rhythm is completely different. There's a quiet noise that never really stops. Future payments running in the background of your mind. That subtle hesitation before opening your banking app. The instant calculation that happens every time you swipe a card. Almost no one sees this part, but it shapes your days more than the images ever could. What makes this especially heavy is that it doesn't feel dramatic. There's no obvious crisis, no single moment where things collapse. It's a slow drain, a mental tab. That's always open. You tell yourself it's temporary, that it will ease once things settle down, but somehow they never do. And after each purchase that was supposed to feel like relief, there's a brief high followed by a familiar weight, a quiet guilt that doesn't announce itself but lingers. This is where the illusion becomes emotionally expensive, because it stops being about money and starts being about energy, the kind of energy you don't notice until it's gone. Decision fatigue creeps in. Small choices feel heavier. You're more irritable than you used to be, more tired, even when nothing particularly difficult happened that day. You look fine, you function, you keep up appearances, but something feels constantly tight inside. This seems normal, but it isn't. There's a truth hidden in plain sight here. Many people trapped in this cycle aren't reckless or irresponsible. They're disciplined in the wrong direction. They're managing payments, tracking dates, optimizing cash flow, just enough to maintain an image. But that effort comes at a psychological cost. The silence around it makes it worse. You don't talk about it, because on the surface everything looks good. Complaining would feel ungrateful, so the stress stays internal. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because once you recognize this pattern, you realize how closely it's tied to reward loops. The system teaches you to associate spending with relief, with progress, with proof that you're doing well. But The relief never lasts because it was never designed to. It's a cycle that feeds on anticipation, not satisfaction, and over time, that cycle reshapes your mindset, your decisions, even how you define success and rest. This is the invisible impact most people don't prepare for. The true cost of this kind of luxury isn't the interest rate or the balance itself. It's the constant mental negotiation, the background anxiety, the feeling that you can't fully relax because something is always pending. When you see it clearly, it changes how you interpret not just your spending but your entire journey. If any of this hit closer than you expected, you can put it into words here. You can leave a comment saying, "I'm on this journey too." Once you reach this point, something important starts to shift, because the question is no longer, why do people do this, but why does this work so well on us? And this is where behavioral finance quietly enters the conversation. Our brains are wired to read visual signals as shortcuts to safety and belonging. For most of human history, status wasn't about showing off, it was about survival cues. Who had access to resources, who was protected, who belonged to the group. Those instincts never disappeared, they simply adapted to screens. So when you see a lifestyle that looks calm, curated, and socially approved, your brain doesn't process it as entertainment. It processes it as information, signals of stability, success, and acceptance. Instagram delivers those signals perfectly, but it leaves out the most important part, context. You see the outcome without the structure, the reward without the cost, the image without the decisions that made it possible. Almost no one consciously realizes this, yet it shapes behavior in powerful ways. This is why comparison feels urgent instead of rational. It isn't a logical assessment of income versus expenses. It's an emotional response to perceived status gaps. Your brain interprets those gaps as something that needs to be closed quickly. That urgency pushes decisions that feel reasonable in the moment, even when they don't align with long-term clarity. This can look like poor discipline, but it isn't. It's misdirected adaptation. Here's a truth that often comes as a relief. If you've ever felt pulled into this cycle, it doesn't mean you're weak or irresponsible. It means your brain is responding exactly as it was designed to, just in an environment it was never meant for. Endless exposure to curated lifestyles creates a distorted sense of normal. What should feel exceptional starts to feel basic, and once that mental shift happens, restraint begins to feel like deprivation instead of wisdom. Now, I want to go even deeper into this because this is where mindset really comes into play. When visual status becomes the benchmark, planning loses its emotional appeal. Saving feels boring. Saying no feels like falling behind. The dopamine hit comes from alignment with the image, not alignment with your values. Over time, this reshapes how you define progress, success, even rest. You're no longer responding to your own needs, but to a stream of stimuli that never pauses. The impact of this goes beyond spending. It affects confidence, it affects self-trust. You start second-guessing decisions that once felt solid simply because they don't photograph well. And that's the most subtle trap of all, when external signals slowly replace internal judgment. Understanding this doesn't instantly fix the problem, but it does something equally important. It restores dignity. It reframes the struggle as a human response, not a personal failure. If this perspective changed the way you see your own decisions, you can leave a small note here. You can comment, "This makes sense to me." At this point, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore because there's another kind of financial life happening quietly in the background, and it rarely shows. Up on a screen, it doesn't trend, it doesn't photograph well, and that's exactly why it's so easy to overlook. Financially healthy lives often look almost boring from the outside. The routines are predictable, the decisions repeat themselves. There's very little drama, very little urgency, and almost no need to announce progress publicly. These are lives built around consistency instead of performance. The same grocery store, the same spending patterns, the same boundaries respected month after month. Pleasure still exists, but it isn't staged. It's chosen privately without the pressure to turn it into proof. Progress happens slowly, sometimes invisibly, and that slowness is precisely what makes it stable. This may seem unremarkable, but it's quietly powerful. What's interesting is how different the mindset feels here. There's less internal noise, fewer negotiations with the future. Decisions aren't made to protect an image, but to protect energy, flexibility, and peace. Almost no one envies this life online because it doesn't trigger aspiration. Yet it's the structure that holds everything together. What happens behind the scenes matters more than the display. And here's where the perspective really shifts. People living this way aren't missing out. They're opting out. They've stepped away from the need to constantly validate their journey. Their financial identity isn't built on moments, but on systems. That choice changes how time feels, how rest feels, how risk is. Evaluated, it's a completely different relationship with money, one that prioritizes sustainability over stimulation. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because once you notice this contrast, a quiet question starts to form. How does the routine of someone who doesn't need to prove anything actually work? What decisions do they repeat when no one is watching? What do they say no to, even when they could afford to say yes? These aren't flashy answers, but they hold a hidden truth that rarely gets explored. This is where the idea of luxury subtly transforms, not into something smaller, but into something quieter. Freedom from comparison, freedom from urgency, freedom from turning every choice into a statement. Maybe that's why it doesn't show up online very often. There's nothing to sell, nothing to perform, nothing to defend, just a steady journey built on alignment rather than attention. If this way of seeing things shifted something inside you, even slightly, you can mark that moment here. You can comment, "This makes sense to me." If you made it all the way here, it probably means this conversation touched something real for you. Not in a loud way, but in that quiet, reflective space where things start to click. And that's exactly the kind of space this channel is meant to hold. If this way of looking at money, behavior, and expectations brought you a bit more clarity, subscribing is simply a way of continuing that journey together, one honest conversation at a time. You can also let me know you were here by leaving a comment. Something simple like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you till the end." It's less about the words themselves and more about marking that moment of recognition. And if you felt that sense of connection while watching, a like quietly helps keep this kind of dialogue alive and reaching people who might be feeling the same pressure but haven't put it into words yet. There's a video right here that naturally deepens everything we talked about today. It connects directly to this idea of appearances versus sustainability. Click it and keep going with me over there.